I would like to thank Srinath sir, Dr. Karthik and Sriram for inviting me. My topic for today is probably the last one and also a complication that we don't see very often is Frey syndrome and the first bite syndrome. So as soon as I heard this is what I have to present, the first thing that came to my mind is that I don't know much about it. And when I did an extensive literature search for this presentation also, and I still continue to say I probably don't know much about it because the literature regarding these two syndromes is extremely limited. So putting this together, is it right? Yes, both these syndromes are a result of aberration or alteration in the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Both these syndromes have a very varied incidence rates in the literature, and also they do not have a definitive treatment protocol in the literature. And they both are good together for another reason, that they are a self-perceived consequence of a surgery. What do I mean by that is that although this complication has occurred or the patient is having Frey syndrome or first bite syndrome, how the patient perceives the complication is how we are going to treat. So even if the patient is having Frey syndrome, having first bite syndrome, but is not complaining about it, is not bothered by it, then we're not going to treat these two syndromes. Frey syndrome is classically clinically described as gustatory flushing in the parotid region and sweating. This was first described by Dr. Lucia Frey in 1923, who was a Polish neurologist. And when we look at the literature, the description of Frey syndrome goes all the way back up to 1957. But it was actually Dr. Lucia Frey in 1923 when she described a gunshot wound to the parotid region and described the classical Frey syndrome. But it was not until 1932 was when the Frey syndrome was actually attributed as a consequence of our parotid surgery. So why does Frey syndrome happen? This is mainly because of the crossover of the postganglionic parasympathetic nerves that supply the sweat glands of the skin overlying the parotid after a surgery. So what happens after a parotid surgery? There is, I think.
Change it.
No, sir. I think there is some spacing issue that happened from Mac to
Yeah, it's happened for me. Don't worry.
Okay. So what exactly happens is that the parasympathetic nervous system nerve that travels through the auriculotemporal nerve through the otic ganglion. So after a parotidectomy, there is a space that is created between the nerve fiber endings and the overlying parotid skin. So because there is release of neurotropic factors both by the parotid and the overlying sweat glands, there is aberrant regeneration of the nerve fibers and there is a crossover and synkinesis that results in Frey syndrome. So when we look at literature, again, parotidectomy, facelift surgeries, carotid end arterectomy, trauma, and even there are 2 reports of submandibular gland excision resulting in Frey syndrome. But we know that parotidectomy and trauma are the commonest causes. So after parotidectomy, let me say that the incidence is varied again. It ranges between 12 to 62%, but it can raise to 98% if we start doing the minor starch iodine test in all our cases. And the occurrence is usually also varied between 20 days to up to 2 years after our surgery, with a median occurrence at 11 months. So how do we manage it? We need to predict that Frey syndrome is going to happen, then prevent it and identify it when it occurs and then treat it. So what are the predictors of Frey syndrome? So again, limited literature. This was just one study that I found that was published in 2017, who studied the tumor characteristics that can cause Frey syndrome, and they saw that parotid tumors that are larger than 2 centimeters almost had a double the incidence of Frey syndrome. So does our incision matter in avoiding Frey syndrome? Although literature says that the facelift does have a lower incidence of Freys, but we should also remember that facelift incisions are commonly used in smaller tumors and hence probably the lower incidence. Our next important predictor is probably flap thickness. Again, there was just a single study that was published in 1980 who studied the difference between the scalpel technique where the parotidectomy skin flap was extremely thin and the flap was elevated at the level of the hair follicle. And they compared that with the Caesar dissection where the flap thickness was much thicker, and there was the classically how we do as fat up and fat down. And they saw that the patients surgeons who were using scalpel technique had a higher incidence of frizz. But the recent comparisons when they have used objective methods to measure the skin thickness and measure frizz syndrome have seen that a thicker flap does not avoid it completely, but yes, it does decrease the surface area that it affects and also the severity of the disease. Does the parotidectomy's extent of parotidectomy matter? Probably yes. But again, that is not something that we can decide. It is most often the tumor extent is what tells us how much of parotid we remove. We can never remove less parotid just because we want to prevent frizz syndrome. So we know when we are dealing with a larger tumor, when we have a thin skin flap, or when we have done a large parotid resection, we know this patient is more prone for frizz. So how do we prevent it? By maintaining adequate flap thickness. The classical teaching of using is probably the SMAS layer, which divides the deep and the superficial adipose tissue of the face or the cheek. So remember, when we say fat up and fat down, it is nothing but going between the superficial and the deep layer of the adipose tissue of the cheek, and by doing so, our SMAS layer actually goes upwards into the skin flap. This is not only a good avascular plane, but is also ideal in keeping our flap thickness adequate. And how do you identify this space? If you go right about here, overlaying the parotid, you might miss this plane. Probably for beginners, it is easier for you to identify this plane because it is in line with your platysma. So when you give your neck incision, make sure you identify your platysma and and follow the same plane and the same thickness all throughout your parotidectomy. Although we can skip the video for time constraint. So what are the local and the regional tissue advancements that we can do? One is probably sternocleidomastoid muscle, wherein you take a L-shaped upper 1/3 of the sternocleidomastoid and swing it into the parotidectomy defect. Although this is one of the most commonly used method that is spoken about, a recent meta-analysis has shown that it is not very effective in preventing frizz. The reason for this could be basic anatomical reason. And why is that so? We all know the sternocleidomastoid has a segmental blood supply. So when we are removing sternocleidomastoid partially and just turning it upwards into the defect, we know we are turning an avascular muscle into the defect. So that is probably going to necrose and cause more problems than do any good. The next commoner flap that is used is a temporoparietal flap, which is based on the superficial temporal artery, and because it lies right above our parotidectomy defect, and it is probably more ideal to be used than a sternocleidomastoid muscle flap. Another commonly described is the SMAS flap, but we should remember that when we are talking about maintaining the thickness of the skin flap, we are also talking about SMAS flap. So the main difference in this approach is that you divide or you elevate the SMAS away from the skin, but when you're suturing it back into the parotid, you plicate the flap. So that means you are actually tightening the flap. So the flap is smaller than the defect, and the same thing holds good even for temporoparietal flap. This is done mainly because you don't want your skin, your flap, everything to collapse into the parotidectomy defect. So this way you can give a good contour correction along with your avoiding your frizz syndrome. Free tissue applications like acellular dermal grafts and also free fat grafts have also been described, which have shown good efficacy at least in reducing the severity and incidence of frizz. But when you look at the cost effectiveness, probably a free fat graft is more ideal to be used because you can see there's a huge cost difference between an acellular dermal graft and a free fat graft. So when we compare all these strategies, we can see that the temporoparietal flap and acellular dermal matrix and a free graft are probably better surgical modalities to prevent Fraze syndrome than others that have been classically described. So how do you identify Fraze syndrome? Classical minor starch test where you can use Lugol's iodine, paint the parotid area with Lugol's iodine and use a starch powder over it, and then you give patient something that is very sour to induce salivation, and you can see the discoloration. The only objective way to measure Fraze is was published by Luna Ortiz et al. And although this is not validated, I found only one more study that has validated the scoring system. But today, this is the only objective way of measuring Fraze syndrome. So, how do you treat Fraze syndrome once it occurs? When you look at literature, in earlier days, you can see that most of these cases were treated with tympanic neurectomy. So, even though these patients had underwent tympanic neurectomy, you can see that their Fraze syndrome did not really come down; it only reduced in severity. And as years pass by, and in the most recent years, you can see that we have gone into more conservative methods like using temporoparietal fascia flap or using a fat injection and a Botox injection. Today, Botox injection intradermally into the parotid is probably the first line of treatment for Fraze syndrome. And along with when we do our minor starch test, you have to mark your area of where the Fraze is happening, and then you divide them into 1 centimeter squares, and then you can inject 2 units of Botox into each square intradermally. So this kind of gives you a good control of how much Botox you're injecting. Although this is just a single paper, again, the treatment is not standardized. Most of the surgical treatment for Fraze they lack consensus, and surgery should only be reserved when medical treatment fails. First bite syndrome, again, unlike Fraze syndrome, this was very recently described, and probably the first description was in 1986, and it was only in 1998 was the first bite syndrome correctly described by James Nettaway. So even here it is again imbalance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. So what exactly happens is that there is de-innervation of the sympathetic nerve, the sympathetic nerve damage, which leads to hyper-excitement or hyper-stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system, which leads to contraction of the myoepithelial cells. So every time the patient bites, especially during their first bite, they have an intense sharp pain, which is classically localized to the parotid area. So how do you diagnose? It is almost always clinical. Common differential, but before you make a diagnosis of first bite, you will have to rule out temporomandibular joint dysfunction, gastroesophageal reflex, glossopharyngeal neuralgia, and also styalgia before making a diagnosis of first bite. So this is the proposed criteria, which is mainly clinical and is based on the history of the patient that gives you. And again, there is no diagnostic test that will tell you that this is actually first bite syndrome. So what causes first bite syndrome? Again, various surgeries, especially that are limited to the upper neck, which includes parapharyngeal space, infratemporal fossa, parotidectomy, all of them can cause first bite syndrome, although parotidectomy is one of the commonest, followed along with the parapharyngeal space lesions. But when a patient comes to you with a history of first bite syndrome, but you see that there is no history of upper neck surgery, can that happen in head and neck oncology? Yes. This can happen when there is parasympathetic overstimulation. This has been reported in few cases where in tumors of deep lobe of parotid or tumors sitting in a parapharyngeal space or a temporal bone, and most common tumors that does present like first bite syndrome are adenoid cystic, mucoepidermoid, and also synovial sarcomas. And when we know there is no history of surgery, and the patient is having symptoms of first bite, always get a cross-sectional imaging done to rule out this. So what actually happens in first bite syndrome is that most of these symptoms improve over time, over a year. And the medical treatment again has various medications like carbamazepine, gabapentin, pregabalin, and amitriptyline has been used. But again, botulinum toxin injection into the gland, parotid gland itself, gives the best relief in first bite syndrome. So, unlike phrase, there is absolutely no standardized method of giving botulinum toxin injection into the parotid duct. Although the efficacy does last for 6 months, most of these patients do have recurrence of symptoms, but which can be managed easily by a repeat injection. Radiotherapy also has been although nobody advises radiotherapy as a treatment for first bite syndrome, but this is probably one of the reasons why most of our patients don't develop first bite syndrome, because all you need is just 15 grays of radiotherapy to kill our hypersensitive parasympathetic nerve endings. So among the two, which is the worst? When we compare, first bite syndrome probably impacts the quality of life of the patient. This is mainly because their everyday food intake gets affected. So most patients are more bothered about first bite syndrome than they're bothered about phrase. And when we look at Indian scenario, we have very limited reports from India. One of the main reason could be, as oncologists, as I told you, for first bite, most of our tumors are malignant tumors. Most of them do undergo extensive parotid resection and radiotherapy, which itself will take care of the first bite syndrome. However, with phrase, because of the skin color, obviously most of the patients also don't perceive it, and neither do the surgeons perceive phrase syndrome. And most of our skin flap elevation is standardized today, and I don't think anybody raises the skin flap unless the tumor unless the tumor margins require it. And we normally don't do a routine starch test, and that could be why we miss out a lot of patients. So to conclude, phrase syndrome can be prevented when we know we are dealing with large tumors and a thin skin flap. Remember, tissue interposition and adequate skin flap thickness is all that we need. And for first bite is more than a complication, it is more of a consequence. There is no way you can avoid a first bite syndrome, but even if it does occur, we should remember that it is most often, it does resolve on itself, and the treatment for both these syndromes has been botulinum toxin. Thank you.
Thank you for a very engaging talk, ma'am. As you said, we don't clinically encounter phrase and first bite syndrome, but whenever we do encounter, we do face a dilemma how to manage these patients. Any questions from audience?
I think that was a very nice presentation, because it's not often that we would encounter. It's because we do not ask the patients. So whenever we do large parapharyngeal space schwannomas and adenomas, most of the patients will complain of having first bite syndrome. And of course, after parotidectomy, we are seeing the the phrase syndrome occurring, and that is usually in the areas where it is already very thin. When we are doing a submass flap elevation, but in spite of that, we do get phrase syndrome, and it is up to us to ask the patients. Patients will complain only if they are very excessively troubled.
Actually, when I was reading this, I called up Bridhi. I asked, "Have you seen any phrase?" So she told me she has seen one, and that probably, I had to question myself that probably I'm not examining my patient well post-operatively. That I'm actually missing out phrase probably.
60%.
Yeah.
So when we started asking our patients, they have a gustatory sweating. It's not troubling them.
Yes.
And it is not excessive. It's not as though that they're going to start sweating. It'll be just a little wetness they have, usually around the zygoma, because that's the area where we are not actually dissecting a lot of the parotid tissue. Most of us will end up, at the level of the tragus and below.
True.
I think I have seen few cases, as Dr. Pratmesh Pai said, unless we ask, they don't complain. But if you ask many people, they say there is a gustatory sweating. Actually, in my experience, one or two patients, they were bothered about Frey syndrome. Of course, very extensive parotid resection. I counseled them, and after detailed counseling and the problems of revision procedure, flap and reconstructions, putting some fat underneath the skin, they didn't accept it for surgery. Even I have not encouraged surgery. This is my experience. One or two patient, of course, they use kerchief or while eating food. That's all the problems that they complain.
Thank you.
Ever since we started using fat grafts, the incidence has gone down.
You routinely use it in all.
No, the ones where the tumor, the parotid tissue was very large, and the patients would have had when the patients have cosmetic concerns, in those patients we have used, and in those patients we have seen that they don't seem to have Frey syndrome. Like you said, the minor starch iodine test, nobody does it unless you want to use it for a presentation.
So even the Lysitra's textbook, which is coming, the textbook on salivary gland. So in that, when they discuss about the Frey syndrome and first right syndrome, so the first point what we says is don't ask about Frey syndrome. So that's how you avoid it. So although we are doing the same, so the real world data is underrepresented, but yeah. So have you ever done neurectomies for?
Never done.
Never.
We have done two cases. We have done botulinum
Botulinum.
because they were really troubled. It was actually the patient moment started eating was sweating.
Right. So doesn't that hamper the facial nerve around
We didn't
any
actually
particular-
do the way they have described,
Right.
but it was when we did that starch iodine, wherever it was more dense,
Then so only focal
only in those areas we use.
It's actually intradermal.
intradermal, right?
Yeah.
But for first bite, it is intraparotid.
Parotid,
Something we should be careful of.
Careful,
Ma'am, we had one case during our postgraduate days. The patient was operated elsewhere and was referred to us. The patient's only complaint was whenever I put makeup, it starts becoming patchy. So when she had come there and we did a minor starch iodine insert, but to our surprise, that was a very big starch iodine. It's put on YouTube as well. It's almost 10 years now. That was my first and last case of. The video has almost got 180 views so far. That is what I could see from it. But what we did was we made a small grid, as you mentioned, 1 into 1 centimeters, and we gave Botox. But she afforded the first and second time. Later, she resorted to those powders, the ones which cricketers use, which they put for antiperspirants. That's what she resorted to because it became a little costly. And she was not willing for any tympanic neurectomy and all those historical importance. The only thing which we took home as a message was respect the planes and do the surgery well. This mass plane and all. But we saw a very huge defect. Probably she had a very big parotid. But she was from Raichur actually. That's where I did my PG, and she just came for follow-up with this complaint. The only complaint she had was it sweats, and in this area, my makeup starts getting, that's her complaint.
Thanks,
I've been
Dinesh.
told there are makeups which don't get better.
Yeah.
Probably Raichur it may get a bit costlier for that. So. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.